My husband Ander brought his pregnant mistress to our 15th anniversary dinner and proudly announced she was carrying his child. What he didn't know was that the DNA test results in my purse would destroy both their lives before dessert arrived. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. D. Golden chandeliers of Meridian Gardens cast their warm glow across the intimate dining room as I watched my husband of 15 years guide his very pregnant mistress to our anniversary table. Jasmine, 26, radiant with that pregnancy glow, and sporting a diamond bracelet I'd never seen before, settled carefully into the chair that should have been mine alone tonight. "Erica, I'd like you to meet Jasmine," Ander said with the same confident tone he used in corporate boardrooms, his hand protectively resting on her rounded belly. "She's carrying our son." Those 6 words hung in the air like a death sentence, shattering the carefully orchestrated evening I'd been planning for months. 15 years of marriage, reduced to a cruel introduction over appetizers. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd chosen this restaurant specifically for tonight, knowing it would be the perfect setting for what was about to unfold. Jasmine shifted, uncomfortably in her seat, her emerald maternity dress straining against her 7-month belly. She couldn't have been more than a year out of college when this affair began, young enough to believe every lie Ander had fed her about our loveless marriage and his plans for divorce, young enough to think she'd won some great prize. I thought, "We should all have dinner together," Ander continued, pouring himself a glass of the 1995 Chateau Margaux I'd specifically ordered, our traditional anniversary wine, now serving as a prop in his twisted theater. "Clear the air before the baby arrives. No need for animosity." The sheer audacity took my breath away. He'd actually convinced himself this was a mature, reasonable approach to destroying our marriage, that I should be grateful for his honesty, appreciative of being included in the celebration of his betrayal. I studied Jasmine's face as she avoided my eyes, focusing instead on the breadbasket. There was something almost fragile about her, despite the confident facade. The way her hand instinctively moved to her belly when nervous, the slight tremor in her voice when she'd whispered hello upon sitting down. She was scared, not of me, but of something else entirely. "How thoughtful of you both," I replied, lifting my wine glass with a steady hand. My voice remained calm, controlled, betraying none of the satisfaction building in my chest. "To new beginnings," Ander smiled, clearly pleased with what he perceived as my gracious acceptance of the situation. He'd always underestimated me, mistaking my quiet strength for submission, my patience for passivity. In his mind, I was the dutiful wife who'd spent 15 years supporting his career, hosting his business dinners, and turning a blind eye to his increasingly frequent business trips. What Ander didn't realize as he confidently outlined his plans for our amicable divorce was that Jasmine's Hermes handbag, a gift he'd bragged about giving her last month, contained more than just lipstick and breath mints. Those late-night phone calls she'd been making while he showered, they weren't to her mother. The restaurant's ambient lighting caught the nervous perspiration on Jasmine's forehead as I reached into my own purse. My fingers brushed against the manila envelope that would change everything. DNA test results that had arrived just this morning, results that would shatter the fantasy they'd built together. "Before we discuss the future," I said, maintaining my composed smile, "I think there's something you both should see." Ander's brow furrowed slightly, the first crack in his confident facade. "What do you mean?" I pulled out the envelope with deliberate slowness, aware of how both their eyes followed my movements. Inside were documents that represented months of careful investigation, strategic planning, and patient execution. The DNA test was just the beginning, the key that would unlock a cascade of revelations neither of them saw coming. You know, Ander, in all our years together, you've never asked about my work at the private investigation firm, I continued, breaking the wax seal on the envelope. Specifically, my specialization in paternity fraud cases. The color began to drain from Jasmine's face. She knew exactly what was in that envelope, because she'd been dreading this moment since the night she'd made a crucial phone call 3 weeks ago. What is this? Ander demanded, his corporate authority wavering for the first time that evening. The truth, I replied simply, pulling out the first document. Starting with the fact that the child Jasmine is carrying isn't yours. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as Ander's confident world began to crumble, piece by piece. Jasmine's hand flew to her mouth, tears already forming in her eyes. But this was just the opening move in a game I'd been playing since I'd first discovered their affair 8 months ago. Every Tuesday evening, Ander had claimed to be working late. Every weekend golf trip with clients. Every suspicious credit card charge and mysterious phone call. While he thought he was being cleverly discreet, I'd been building a case that would destroy not just his marriage, but his career, his reputation, and his carefully constructed image of himself as the successful, powerful executive. The paternity test was devastating, but it was far from the only surprise I had planned for tonight. Those business trips where he'd supposedly been courting the Wellington Industries account, entirely fabricated. The consulting fees he'd been funneling through shell companies, all documented. The sexual harassment settlements he'd made the company pay on his behalf, copies sitting in my car. But first, I wanted to savor this moment. Watching the man who'd treated me like a discarded accessory realize that his pregnant mistress had been playing him just as thoroughly as he'd been playing me. The baby she claimed was his belonged to someone else entirely, someone she'd been seeing long before Ander ever laid a hand on her. This has to be wrong, Ander whispered, staring at the paternity report. You fabricated this somehow. I smiled, finally allowing a hint of steel to enter my voice. Oh, darling, this is just the beginning. Tonight wasn't the end of my marriage. It was the culmination of the most elaborate investigation I'd ever conducted. Every tear I'd shed over his betrayal had become fuel for this moment. Every lie he'd told had become evidence in the case I'd been building. As I watched them both struggle to process what they'd just learned, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. The evening was still young, and I had so much more to show them. The next 8 hours would reveal the true scope of their deceptions, and mine. The road to this moment had begun 15 years ago when I first met Ander Blackwood at a corporate law conference in Chicago. I was a junior investigator at Morrison & Associates, specializing in financial fraud cases, and he was the rising star at Blackwood Industries, the manufacturing empire his father had built from nothing. Our courtship had been a whirlwind of expensive dinners, weekend getaways to his family's estate in the Hamptons, and promises of a partnership that would elevate us both. Ander spoke eloquently about building something together, about how my investigative skills would complement his business acumen. What I didn't realize then was that he was already calculating how to neutralize any threat I might pose to his future plans. You're too talented to waste on corporate investigations, he'd whispered during our honeymoon in Tuscany. Think bigger, Erica. Private clients, wealthy families who need discretion. I can introduce you to the right people. Within 6 months of our marriage, I'd left Morrison & Associates and opened Meridian Investigations, focusing on high-net-worth clients dealing with matrimonial disputes and family matters. The irony wasn't lost on me now. Ander had pushed me into specializing in exactly the kind of cases that would eventually destroy him. Our early years had been golden, or so I'd thought. Ander's career skyrocketed as he modernized his father's traditional manufacturing company, branching into tech partnerships and overseas ventures. I built my practice carefully, earning a reputation for discretion and thoroughness among Phoenix's elite circles. We were the power couple everyone admired, successful, attractive, seemingly devoted to each other. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first crack appeared 3 years ago when Anders' father, Ian Blackwood, suffered a stroke that left him partially incapacitated. Overnight, Ander went from heir apparent to acting CEO, and the power went straight to his head. The man who'd once consulted me on every major decision suddenly began making unilateral choices about our life, our finances, our future. The company needs my full attention right now, he'd explained when I questioned his increasingly frequent absences. Dad's recovery depends on maintaining stability in the business. You understand, don't you? I understood more than he realized. My training had taught me to recognize patterns, and Anders' behavior was following a textbook trajectory of a man whose moral compass was deteriorating along with his respect for boundaries. The late-night phone calls he claimed were with international suppliers, the credit card charges at restaurants I'd never visited, the sudden need for team-building weekends that didn't include spouses. But it was 18 months ago that I found the first concrete evidence, a receipt for a jewelry purchase that coincided with my birthday, yet I'd received nothing. The timing was too specific to be coincidental, too expensive to be casual. Someone was receiving gifts meant for special occasions, and it wasn't me. That night, I sat in my home office surrounded by the tools of my trade, surveillance equipment, database access, contact networks throughout the city, and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to investigate my own husband with the same methodical precision I brought to every case. The initial surveillance was heartbreaking but not surprising. Ander was meeting someone regularly at the Grandview Hotel, always on Tuesday evenings, always for exactly 2 hours. The woman was young, blonde, and clearly smitten with the attention from an older, powerful man. At first, I assumed she was just another affair, painful, but manageable through divorce proceedings. Then I discovered her identity. Jasmine Taylor, a marketing coordinator at Blackwood Industries who'd been hired 8 months earlier. Fresh out of Arizona State University, ambitious and desperately eager to please her charismatic boss. The classic predator-prey dynamic that I'd seen destroy countless families in my professional work. What made this different was the timeline. As I dug deeper into their relationship, cross-referencing Anders' travel schedules with company records and Jasmine's employment history, I discovered something that changed everything. This wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated seduction, designed to create leverage. Jasmine hadn't been randomly hired. Her resume showed gaps that didn't align with her references. Her college transcripts, when I finally accessed them through a contact at ASU, showed she'd actually graduated 2 years earlier than claimed, meaning she'd been doing something else entirely before joining Blackwood Industries. The deeper I dug, the more complex the web became. Jasmine had been in contact with representatives from Hawthorne Corporation, Blackwood Industries' primary competitor, for months before her affair with Ander began. Phone records showed regular communication with a Stephen Hawthorne Jr., the heir to the competing empire. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with a simple adultery case. This was corporate espionage wrapped in a honey trap, and my husband was too arrogant and sex-obsessed to see it. Jasmine was feeding information about Blackwood Industries' expansion plans, client lists, and proprietary technology to their biggest rival, using her intimate access to Ander as her source. But there was another layer I hadn't expected. 3 months ago, when Jasmine announced her pregnancy to Ander, I'd watched through surveillance footage as his entire demeanor changed. The casual affair became serious overnight. He started making promises about leaving me, about building a future together, about their son inheriting everything he'd worked for. That's when I knew I had to act decisively. Not just to save my marriage, that was already over, but to prevent Ander from destroying his father's legacy through his own stupidity and greed. The pregnancy had given me the perfect opportunity. Using my connections in the medical field, I'd arranged for DNA testing that Jasmine didn't even know was happening, a few strands of hair from her coat when she visited the office. Samples from drinking glasses at restaurants where she met Ander, building a genetic profile that would either confirm or destroy the foundation of their relationship. When the results came back yesterday morning, I felt a mixture of vindication and disgust. The child Jasmine was carrying belonged to Stephen Hawthorne Jr., the same man who'd been receiving insider information about Blackwood Industries for months. Jasmine hadn't just been playing Ander for business intelligence, she'd been playing him for paternity fraud as well. Now, as I sat across from them both at Meridian Gardens, watching Ander's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and dawning comprehension, I felt the satisfaction of a job well done. Months of careful investigation, strategic planning, and patient execution had led to this moment. But the DNA test was just the opening salvo. Tonight, I would reveal the full scope of their betrayals and show them both what happened when they underestimated Erica Blackwood. Back in the present moment at Meridian Gardens, Ander straightened his Italian silk tie and assumed the commanding posture that had intimidated boardrooms for years. He was performing, putting on the show of a man in complete control of an uncomfortable but necessary situation. "I know this is difficult, Erica," he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. "But we're all adults here. Jasmine and I have been planning this conversation for weeks." Jasmine nodded eagerly, her manicured hand resting protectively over her rounded belly. The diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist caught the candlelight. Easily worth $30,000, far more than any marketing coordinator could afford. On her salary. Ander's generosity with company funds had always been impressive when it served his purposes. "I want you to know that this isn't about anything you did wrong," Jasmine said softly, finally meeting my eyes. Her voice carried a rehearsed quality, like she'd practiced this speech in the mirror. We just fell in love. Sometimes these things happen." The naive sincerity in her voice was almost endearing. She genuinely believed she was the first woman to capture Ander's wandering attention, the special one who'd finally tamed the powerful executive. She had no idea she was just the latest in a long line of ambitious young women who'd mistaken his manipulation for affection. "Of course," I replied, taking another sip of wine. "Love is unpredictable." Ander relaxed slightly, interpreting my calm response as acceptance. He launched into what was clearly a prepared presentation about our mutual interests and amicable dissolution. He'd even brought printouts, financial projections showing how our assets would be divided, custody arrangements for weekends with his son, timeline for my moving out of our Scottsdale estate. "I've already spoken with Harrison and associates about handling the divorce proceedings," he continued, sliding a business card across the white tablecloth. "They're the best family law firm in Phoenix. They'll make sure you're taken care of." The sheer arrogance was breathtaking. He'd not only planned my divorce without consulting me, but had chosen the lawyers, decided the terms, and was now presenting it all as a generous gift. In his mind, I should be grateful for his consideration in not simply throwing me out onto the street. Jasmine watched this exchange with growing confidence. Each moment that passed without screaming or tears seemed to validate her belief that she'd won some great prize. She began to participate more actively in the conversation, offering insights about co-parenting arrangements and suggesting restaurants where we could meet for family dinners once their son was born. "We want him to know his stepmother," she explained earnestly. "Children need stability, and you've been such an important part of Ander's life." Stepmother. The word hung in the air like a slap. In her fantasy, I would gracefully transition from wife to supportive secondary figure, grateful for any crumbs of inclusion in the life they were building together. She had it all planned out. I would be the sophisticated older woman who'd help her learn to navigate Phoenix society, the mentor who'd teach her how to host charity galas and manage household staff. "You're very thoughtful," I said, studying her face carefully. There was something almost desperate about her eagerness to include me in their plans. This wasn't just politeness or guilt. She needed my approval, my blessing to legitimize what they'd done. Ander pulled out his phone and began showing me photos he'd already taken of the nursery they were designing. Rich mahogany furniture, hand-painted murals, a theme centered around airplanes that supposedly reflected his own childhood dreams of flying. "Jasmine has such wonderful taste," he said proudly. "She chose everything herself." I recognized the furniture set from a catalog I'd seen in my friend Sarah's design studio. Sarah Whitmore, who'd been decorating homes for Phoenix's elite for 20 years, had mentioned this particular collection cost nearly $40,000. For someone supposedly living on a marketing coordinator's salary, Jasmine was certainly living well. "It's beautiful," I acknowledged, watching as Jasmine beamed with pride. "You must be so excited about becoming parents." "We are," Ander said, his hand moving to cover Jasmine's on the table. "Having a son, it changes everything, makes you think about legacy, about what really matters." Legacy. The word hit exactly as he'd intended. This wasn't just about love or passion. This was about Ander's desperate need to prove his virility, his success, his ability to start fresh with a younger model. The son he believed Jasmine was carrying represented his second chance at building the perfect family, one that would reflect his current status rather than the struggling young man I'd married 15 years ago. "Speaking of legacy," I said casually, "how are things at Blackwood Industries? I know your father has been concerned about some of the recent changes." A shadow crossed Ander's face. Ian Blackwood's disapproval of his son's personal choices had been a constant source of tension over the past year. The old man might be partially incapacitated, but his mind remained sharp enough to recognize that Ander's behavior was damaging both the family reputation and the company's stability. "Dad will come around," Ander said dismissively. "Once he meets his grandson, sees how happy Jasmine makes me, he'll understand. Business is business, but family is forever." Jasmine squeezed his hand supportively, playing her role as the devoted future mother perfectly. But I caught the brief flicker of something else in her expression. Calculation, perhaps, or concern. She knew as well as I did that Ian Blackwood's approval would be crucial for her long-term security. "And the Hawthorne acquisition talks?" I asked innocently. "I heard through the business community that there might be some interesting developments there." Both Ander and Jasmine tensed slightly at the mention of Hawthorne Corporation. For Ander, it represented his biggest professional challenge, the competitor that had been steadily encroaching on Blackwood Industries' market share for years. For Jasmine, it was something else entirely. "Just rumors," Ander said quickly. "Nothing concrete. You know how the business press loves to speculate." But Jasmine's reaction was telling. Her free hand moved unconsciously to her purse, where I knew her burner phone was hidden. The same phone she used for her twice-weekly calls to Stephen Hawthorne Jr. The same phone that contained months of text messages detailing Blackwood Industries' strategic plans. I smiled and raised my wine glass again. "Well, I'm sure whatever happens, you'll handle it brilliantly. You always do." The compliment seemed to restore Ander's confidence. He began outlining his vision for expanding Blackwood Industries into new markets, completely unaware that every detail he shared was likely being memorized by the woman carrying another man's child. As I listened to his grand plans and watched Jasmine's careful attention to every word, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. They thought they were orchestrating my humiliation, but they were actually performing exactly as I'd hoped they would. The manila envelope in my purse contained more than just DNA results. Tonight, I would show them both what happened when they underestimated the quiet woman who'd been watching, listening, and documenting their every move for months. The performance was almost over. Soon, it would be time for the real show to begin. The appetizers arrived with perfect timing, delicate seared scallops that neither Jasmine nor I would touch, too focused on the psychological warfare unfolding across the pristine white tablecloth. Ander, however, dove in with the enthusiasm of a man celebrating a victory he believed was already won. "You know, Erica," he said between bites, "I've been thinking about how to handle the announcement. The pregnancy, I mean. We can't keep it quiet much longer, and I want to control the narrative before the business community starts speculating." He pulled out his phone and showed me a draft press release he'd apparently been working on with the company's PR team. The headline read, "Blackwood Industries CEO Ander Blackwood announces engagement following amicable divorce." Engagement. The word hit like a physical blow. Not only was he divorcing me for his pregnant mistress, but he'd already proposed to her. The timeline was staggering in its cruelty. While I'd been planning what I thought was our anniversary celebration, he'd been planning his engagement announcement. "When?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Jasmine extended her left hand across the table, displaying a ring I hadn't noticed before. It was massive, a 5-carat emerald-cut diamond surrounded by smaller stones, easily worth more than most people's annual salaries. The setting was vintage, with intricate platinum filigree that I recognized immediately. "It was your grandmother's ring," I said, staring at the family heirloom that had been promised to me since our engagement. "The one your mother said would be mine someday." Anders' jaw tightened slightly. "Mother understands that circumstances change. She thinks Jasmine will appreciate the ring's history." The casual dismissal of 15 years together, reduced to circumstances, was breathtaking in its coldness. But the ring, that was personal. It had belonged to 4 generations of Blackwood women, each one wearing it as a symbol of their place in the family legacy. Now it adorned the finger of a woman who was carrying another man's child and stealing corporate secrets. She said yes, immediately, Ander continued, his hand finding Jasmine's across the table. "Didn't even need to think about it. That's how you know it's real love." Jasmine blushed prettily, playing her role to perfection. I was so surprised. Ander had this whole romantic evening planned at the estate. Candles, champagne, well, sparkling cider for me, and then he got down on one knee right there in the gao. Rose Garden, where his grandparents got engaged. The Rose Garden, the same place Ander had proposed to me 15 years ago, using the same romantic story about family tradition and eternal love. The recycling of our most intimate moments was almost more painful than the betrayal itself. "How wonderfully traditional," I managed, taking another sip of wine to steady myself. "We're planning a small ceremony," Ander announced. "Just close family and friends. Nothing too elaborate, given the circumstances. We want to be married before the baby arrives." He was laying out their entire future as if I were a wedding planner rather than the wife he was discarding. The guest list, the venue options, the timeline coordinated around Jasmine's pregnancy. Every detail had been decided without any consideration for how I might feel about my husband marrying his mistress, in what would technically still be my home. "The estate will be perfect for a small wedding," Jasmine added enthusiastically. "Anders shown me all the family photos from previous celebrations there. It's so romantic, all that history. My history, my home, my garden." She was planning to erase me completely, stepping into the life I'd built as if I'd never existed. The casual way she discussed taking over everything I held dear, the estate where I'd planned our own wedding, the garden where I'd spent years cultivating rare roses, the family traditions I'd helped maintain, was like watching someone plan to move into your house while you were still living in it. "Of course, you'll need to find somewhere else to live," Ander said, his tone suggesting this was merely a practical matter. "The estate isn't really suitable for separate living arrangements. Too many memories, you understand?" I understood perfectly. He wanted me gone, erased, disappeared from every trace of the life we'd built together. In his version of events, I would quietly pack my belongings and fade into the background while he created new memories with his young wife and their son. "I've already had some preliminary conversations with realtors," he continued. "There's a lovely townhouse development, in North Scottsdale. Very upscale, perfect for a single professional woman, close enough that you could visit when our son is older, but far enough to give everyone space. The sheer audacity was stunning. He'd not only planned my divorce and my future living arrangements, but had determined how much access I would have to his child. I was being managed out of my own life with the same efficiency he brought to corporate restructuring. Jasmine reached across the table and touched my hand with what she probably thought was compassion. I know this is hard, Erica, but I want you to know that I don't see this as taking anything away from you. You and Ander had your time together, and now it's our turn. There's room for everyone in this child's life. Her words were meant to be comforting, but they revealed the depth of her narcissistic delusion. In her mind, she was being generous by allowing me to exist on the periphery of the life she was stealing. I was expected to be grateful for the crumbs of involvement she might throw my way. That's very kind of you, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. Ander smiled approvingly at what he interpreted as my gracious acceptance. You see, I knew you'd handle this maturely. That's what I've always admired about you, Erica, your ability to accept reality and adapt. Adapt. As if his betrayal was a natural disaster I needed to weather rather than a deliberate choice to destroy our marriage. As if 15 years of partnership, sacrifice, and love could be dismissed as easily as a failed business venture. There is one more thing, Ander said, his tone becoming almost apologetic. The prenup we signed, well, it was fairly comprehensive. The estate, the business interests, most of the investment portfolio, they're all protected. But I want to be fair. I'm prepared to offer a settlement that should keep you comfortable. He slid a piece of paper across the table, a financial summary that reduced our entire marriage to a dollar amount. After 15 years of building Blackwood Industries together, supporting his ambitions, and sacrificing my own career trajectory, I was being offered what amounted to a severance package. $2 million, he announced, as if he was being magnanimous. Plus your car and personal belongings, of course. It should be more than enough to start fresh. $2 million. For a woman who'd helped build a company now worth over $50 million, who'd used her investigative expertise to help Ander navigate complex business deals, who'd given up her own promising career to support his ambitions. It was an insult disguised as generosity. Jasmine watched my reaction carefully, perhaps sensing that this moment would determine whether I would accept my dismissal gracefully or cause problems for their perfect plan. Her hand moved protectively to her belly again, a gesture that seemed calculated to remind me of what I could never give Ander. A child, a fresh start, a future uncomplicated by middle-aged disappointments. You're very generous, I said finally, folding the paper and sliding it back across the table. Ander's smile widened, relief flooding his features. He'd successfully managed the most difficult conversation of his life. Convinced that his combination of financial incentive and emotional manipulation had secured my cooperation in my own destruction. What he didn't realize was that his arrogant presentation had just given me everything I needed to destroy both their lives completely. The moment had come to show them exactly who they were dealing with. The waiter approached our table with practiced discretion, refilling wine glasses and clearing the barely touched appetizer plates. His movements were fluid, professional, but I caught the slight hesitation in his step as he sensed the tension radiating from our intimate gathering. 15 years in high-end hospitality had probably taught him to recognize when a celebration was actually an execution. "Will there be anything else before your main courses arrive?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "We're perfect, thank you," Ander replied with the easy confidence of a man who believed he'd successfully navigated the most difficult conversation of his life. His posture had relaxed completely, shoulders settling back into the leather chair, as if a great weight had been lifted from them. Jasmine was practically glowing with relief. Her earlier nervousness had evaporated, replaced by the triumphant satisfaction of a woman who'd claimed her prize without a fight. She was already discussing plans for redecorating the estate, her voice bubbling with excitement about making it our own and creating new memories. "I was thinking we could turn your home office into a playroom," she said to me with breathtaking casualness. "Once you've moved out, of course. The windows face east, so the morning light would be perfect for a nursery expansion as he gets older." Home office. The sanctuary where I'd built Meridian investigations from nothing, where I'd solved cases that had stumped law enforcement, where I'd spent countless hours documenting Anders' betrayals and building the case that would destroy him. She wanted to fill it with toys and nursery rhymes, erasing the last traces of my professional identity from the home I'd shared with her lover. "What a lovely idea," I said, my voice carrying the same pleasant tone I'd maintained throughout this surreal dinner. "Children do need space to grow." Ander beamed at my response, interpreting my calm demeanor as the gracious acceptance he'd hoped for. In his mind, he'd handled an impossible situation with masterful diplomacy, managing to end our marriage while maintaining my goodwill and securing my cooperation in legitimizing his new family. "I knew you'd understand," he said, reaching across the table to pat my hand in a gesture that was probably meant to be comforting but felt utterly patronizing. "This is why I've always admired you, Erica. Your ability to see the bigger picture, to put aside personal feelings for the greater good." The greater good. As if his adultery and corporate espionage were somehow serving a noble purpose that I should gracefully support. The man's capacity for self-deception was truly remarkable. He'd convinced himself that betraying his wife and his father's company was actually an act of maturity and wisdom. Jasmine nodded enthusiastically, eager to reinforce this narrative. "It takes a really strong woman to handle something like this with such grace. I don't know if I could be so understanding." Her words carried an undertone of superiority, the smug satisfaction of someone who believed she'd won a competition, without realizing she'd been playing an entirely different game. She thought my composure was resignation. My politeness was defeat. She had no idea that every word she spoke was digging her grave deeper. "Understanding comes with experience," I replied, taking another measured sip of wine. "You learn to recognize when situations are inevitable." Inevitable. The word seemed to resonate with both of them, confirming their belief that this outcome had been predestined by their irresistible love and my natural inadequacy as a younger man's wife. They were writing a romance novel in their heads, casting themselves as star-crossed lovers who'd overcome obstacles to find their destined happiness. The main courses arrived with perfect timing: filet mignon for Ander, grilled salmon for Jasmine, and the duck confit I'd specifically ordered because it was Anders' least favorite dish. Small acts of rebellion that only I understood, tiny assertions of independence that helped maintain my facade of calm acceptance. "This is excellent," Anders said, cutting into his steak with obvious satisfaction. "Good choice on the restaurant. Erica, very appropriate for the occasion." Appropriate. He thought I'd chosen Meridian Gardens as a venue for my own humiliation, a neutral ground where he could safely destroy our marriage without fear of an ugly scene. He had no idea that I'd selected this restaurant for entirely different reasons. Reasons that would become clear very soon. Jasmine was struggling slightly with her salmon, pregnancy having affected her appetite despite her earlier enthusiasm about the meal. But she persevered, determined to play her part in what she believed was a sophisticated adult conversation about complex emotions and mature choices. "I want you to know," she said between delicate bites, "that I never intended for things to happen this way. When I first started working at Blackwood Industries, I was just focused on building my career. The connection with Ander, it was unexpected." Unexpected. The word almost made me laugh out loud. Her unexpected connection had been planned months, in advance, orchestrated by people she was far too naive to recognize as her handlers. But her genuine belief in her own innocence was almost touching in its complete disconnection from reality. Chemistry is unpredictable, I agreed, watching, as she unconsciously touched her belly again. The gesture was becoming more frequent as the evening progressed, a nervous tic that betrayed her underlying anxiety despite her outward confidence. Ander launched into a detailed explanation of how he'd first noticed Jasmine's exceptional intelligence during marketing presentations, describing her insights with the enthusiasm of a man who'd never encountered original thinking from someone under 30. His patronizing admiration was almost painful to witness. He genuinely believed he was praising her intellect while reducing her to a collection of youthful charms that had captured his middle-aged imagination. "She has such fresh perspectives," he continued, gesturing with his fork. "It's exactly what the company needs. New blood, innovative thinking, freedom from the old ways of doing things. Fresh perspectives on corporate espionage, certainly. Innovative approaches to industrial theft. Freedom from outdated concepts like loyalty and honesty." Jasmine's contributions to Blackwood Industries had indeed been revolutionary, though not in the ways Ander imagined. "Innovation is important," I said, my phone buzzing discreetly in my purse. Right on schedule. The evenings carefully orchestrated. Timeline was proceeding exactly as planned, each piece falling into place with the precision of a Swiss watch. Jasmine excused herself to use the restroom, her pregnancy making the interruption both necessary and convenient. I watched her navigate between tables with the careful balance of a woman carrying precious cargo, one hand protectively cradling her belly, while the other gripped her oversized purse that I knew contained far more than cosmetics and breath mints. "She's remarkable, isn't she?" Ander said once we were alone, his voice carrying the dreamy quality of a man thoroughly besotted. "So young, so full of life. Being with her makes me feel renewed. Renewed. As if his midlife crisis was actually a spiritual awakening rather than a pathetic cliché. But his genuine emotion was unmistakable. Whatever else might be true about their relationship, Ander's feelings for Jasmine were real, which would make what was coming next even more devastating. "She certainly seems devoted to you," I replied, my fingers brushing against the manila envelope in my purse. "And to your future child." The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that only I fully understood. Ander smiled with paternal pride, completely unaware that his dreams of fatherhood were about to be shattered along with everything else he believed about his perfect new life. In a few moments, Jasmine would return from the restroom, probably, having made another quick call on her burner phone to report on the evening's progress. They would both settle back into their comfortable delusion of victory, their satisfied belief that they'd successfully managed the transition from betrayal to legitimacy. And then I would show them exactly how wrong they were about everything. While Jasmine was away from the table, I allowed myself a moment of private reflection, studying my own hands as they rested calmly on the white linen tablecloth. These were the same hands that had signed our marriage certificate 15 years ago, the same hands that had built a successful investigation business, the same hands that had gathered evidence of my husband's betrayal with methodical precision. Tonight, they would deliver justice. The woman who had walked into Meridian Gardens this evening was not the same person who would walk out. The transformation had been gradual, taking place over months of discovery and planning. But this dinner represented the final chrysalis moment. The devoted wife was dying, and something far more dangerous was being born. "You're taking this remarkably well," Ander said, his voice carrying a note of genuine admiration mixed with relief. "I know this can't be easy." Easy. The word almost made me laugh. Nothing about the past 18 months had been easy. Not discovering his affair, not learning about Jasmine's true identity, not uncovering the web of corporate espionage that threatened his father's legacy. But the difficulty had forged something stronger than the trusting woman I'd once been. "I've had time to prepare," I replied, which was perhaps the most honest thing I'd said all evening. Ander leaned back in his chair, finally allowing himself to relax completely. In his mind, the hardest part was over. He'd successfully dismantled our marriage with surgical precision, secured my cooperation, and cleared the path for his new life. The man's capacity for self-deception was truly remarkable. "You know what I've always respected about you, Erica?" he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "Your professionalism. Even in personal matters, you approach things like a business transaction. It's very mature. A business transaction." He was reducing 15 years of marriage to a corporate merger gone wrong, something to be dissolved with proper paperwork and adequate compensation. The casual dehumanization of our relationship was breathtaking, but it also crystallized something important for me. This wasn't about love anymore. It was about justice. I excused myself to the ladies' room, needing a moment away from Anders' satisfied presence to center myself for what was coming next. The reflection in the elegant bathroom mirror showed a woman who appeared composed, controlled, even serene. My makeup was flawless, my hair perfectly styled, my burgundy dress, Anders' favorite color, immaculate. But looking deeper, I could see the steel that had replaced the softness in my eyes. The gentle curves of my mouth had hardened into something more determined. The woman staring back at me was a predator disguised as prey, a hunter who had spent months tracking her quarry. I opened my purse and withdrew my phone, checking the messages that had been arriving throughout dinner. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The pieces I'd set in motion months ago were falling into place with clockwork precision. A text from my colleague Marcus at the Phoenix Police Department. "Package delivered to DA's office. They're very interested." Another from my contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission. "Federal warrant approved. Executing tomorrow morning." A final message from Dr. Sarah Chen at the genetics lab. "Confirmed results. Chain of custody documented. Ready for presentation." I deleted each message after reading, then checked my appearance one final time. The woman in the mirror nodded back at me with grim satisfaction. It was time to return to the table and begin the systematic destruction of everything Ander and Jasmine believed about their future. Walking back through the dining room, I observed the other couples enjoying their romantic dinners, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding at table 12. Their ordinary problems, work stress, family disagreements, financial concerns, seemed almost quaint compared to the web of betrayal and deception I was about to unravel. Jasmine had returned from her own bathroom excursion and was animatedly discussing baby names with Ander, her hands gesturing excitedly as she described her vision for their son's future. The irony was almost unbearable. She was planning a life around a child that didn't belong to the man she was deceiving. "We're thinking Alexander," she was saying as I rejoined them. "After Ander, of course, but also strong and classic." "Alexander? Blackwood has such a nice ring to it. Alexander Blackwood." She wanted to give Stephen Hawthorne Jr.'s child the Blackwood family name, cementing her deception with the most intimate kind of identity theft. The audacity was stunning, but it also represented the final piece of evidence I needed to demonstrate the scope of her fraud. "A strong name," I agreed, settling back into my chair. "Very traditional." Ander beamed with paternal pride, completely unaware that his dreams of legacy and lineage were built on a foundation of lies. "Dad will be thrilled when he meets his grandson. It might even help with his recovery, having something positive to focus on." The mention of Ian Blackwood sent a pang through my chest. The old man had suffered enough with his stroke, and the gradual realization that his son was destroying everything he'd built. Learning about the corporate espionage would devastate him, but it was necessary to save what remained of the family business. "How is your father's health?" I asked, genuinely concerned despite everything. "Improving slowly," Ander replied. "The physical therapy is helping and his speech is getting clearer. Dr. Rodriguez thinks he might be able to return to limited board involvement within 6 months. 6 months. If everything went according to plan, Ian Blackwood would return, to find his company saved from the brink of destruction and his son in federal prison. It wasn't the recovery anyone had envisioned, but it was justice. Jasmine's phone buzzed discreetly, and I watched as she glanced at the screen with practiced casualness. Her face remained neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around her, eyes that suggested the message contained something significant. Probably an update from her handlers at Hawthorne Corporation, wondering about the evening's progress. "Sorry," she murmured, sliding the phone back into her purse. "Just my mother checking in. She's so excited about becoming a grandmother. Her mother." Another lie in the endless web of deception she'd woven around herself. According to my investigation, Jasmine's real mother lived in Minnesota and hadn't spoken to her daughter since she'd changed her identity for the third time. The woman Jasmine occasionally visited in Phoenix was actually her case officer, the person who'd recruited her for this elaborate honey trap operation. "Family is important," I said, my hand moving to the manila envelope in my own purse. "Speaking of which, I have something I'd like to share with both of you." Anders' eyebrows rose slightly, probably expecting some sentimental gesture, a photo album from our marriage, perhaps, or a heartfelt letter wishing them well. He had no idea that the envelope contained the tools of his destruction. "What is it?" Jasmine asked, her voice carrying a note of wariness that hadn't been there earlier. Some primitive instinct was warning her that the evening was about to take an unexpected turn. I smiled with the serene confidence of a woman who held all the cards in a game the other players didn't even know they were playing. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the betrayed wife seeking comfort or closure. I was a force of nature about to reshape their entire world. "Just some information I thought you might find illuminating," I said, my fingers tracing the edge of the envelope. "About family and truth, and the importance of knowing exactly who you're sharing your life with." The moment of reckoning had arrived. I pulled the manila envelope from my purse, with deliberate slowness, placing it on the table between the 3 wine glasses like a card dealer revealing the final hand. The restaurant's ambient lighting caught the crisp edges of the packet, casting sharp shadows across the white tablecloth that seemed to divide our little triangle into distinct territories. "What's that?" Ander asked, his voice carrying the first note of uncertainty I'd heard all evening. His fork paused halfway to his mouth, the perfectly prepared fillet forgotten as his attention focused on the unexpected prop in what he'd believed was a scripted performance. "Information," I replied simply, my fingers tracing the sealed edge without opening it. "About truth, about family, about the importance of knowing exactly who you're dealing with." Jasmine's hand moved instinctively to her belly again, but this time the gesture carried a different quality, protection rather than pride. Some primitive maternal instinct was warning her that the evening had taken an unexpected turn, though she couldn't yet understand the magnitude of what was coming. "Erica," Anders said, setting down his fork entirely and leaning forward with the authoritative posture he used in hostile boardroom negotiations. "If this is some kind of emotional gesture—" "Nothing emotional about it," I interrupted, breaking the wax seal with my fingernail. The sound was surprisingly loud in the intimate space, like a gunshot in a library. "Purely factual, professional even. You said you admired my professionalism, didn't you?" The first document I withdrew was a photograph, a standard surveillance image taken with a telephoto lens outside the Grandview Hotel 6 months ago. It showed Ander and Jasmine entering the building together, his hand possessively on her lower back, her face tilted up toward his with obvious adoration. "Touching," I said, sliding the photo across the table. "But this is just the beginning of the timeline." Anders' face darkened as he recognized the implications. His carefully constructed narrative of a recent, irresistible attraction was already crumbling with this single piece of evidence. 6 months ago, Jasmine was supposed to have been nothing more than a dedicated employee focused on her marketing duties. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "I told you, darling. I run a private investigation firm." Surveillance is rather fundamental to the profession. I pulled out a second photograph, this one showing Jasmine entering a nondescript office building in downtown Phoenix. Recognize the address? Jasmine leaned forward to study the image, and I watched the color drain from her face as she identified the location. It was the same building that housed several subsidiary offices of Hawthorne Corporation, though the business directory was deliberately obscure about which companies operated on which floors. This was taken 7 months ago, I continued conversationally. 2 weeks before you started working at Blackwood Industries, Jasmine. Or should I say, 2 weeks before Elena Kowalski started working there. The silence that followed was deafening. Jasmine's carefully constructed identity was unraveling with surgical precision, each revelation cutting deeper than the last. Her hand found Anders across the table, seeking reassurance from a man who was staring at her with growing confusion and dawning horror. "Elena?" Ander whispered, his corporate confidence evaporating as he struggled to process this fundamental shift. In reality, Jasmine Taylor graduated from Arizona State University 3 years ago, I explained, producing an official transcript from the envelope. She's currently working as a veterinary technician in Flagstaff, has been for 2 years, never worked. In marketing, never applied to Blackwood Industries, never heard of your company until I contacted her last month to verify her identity. I placed a photograph of the real Jasmine Taylor on the table, a cheerful brunette with kind eyes who bore no resemblance to the blonde woman sitting across from us. The identity theft was so complete that even the basic biographical details had been fabricated. Elena Kowalski, I continued, has been using false identities for the past 4 years. The social security number on her employment application belongs to someone else. The references she provided, 2 of them don't exist, and the third is a disconnected phone number. Ander was staring at the woman he'd believed himself in love with as if seeing her for the first time. The romantic narrative he'd constructed was dissolving into something far more sinister, a calculated deception that had targeted him specifically. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "An excellent question," I replied, producing another document from the envelope. One that leads us to Stephen Hawthorne Jr., and a very interesting pattern of communication between his private cell phone and Elena's burner device. The phone records were damning. Months of calls, text messages, and data transfers that painted a clear picture of corporate espionage. Every Tuesday evening when Ander thought he was enjoying a romantic rendezvous, Elena had been downloading classified information about Blackwood Industries' strategic plans, client lists, and proprietary technology. "This is impossible," Ander said, but his voice lacked conviction. The evidence was too comprehensive, too detailed to be fabricated. "Jasmine wouldn't. We're having a baby together." "About that," I said, my tone becoming almost gentle as I prepared to deliver the killing blow. "There's something else you need to know about your future child." Elena, I couldn't think of her as Jasmine anymore, was gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She knew exactly what was coming next, had probably been dreading this moment since the pregnancy test confirmed her worst fears. I withdrew the final document from the envelope with ceremonial precision, the DNA analysis that would destroy both their futures in a single scientific revelation. "Paternity results," I announced, placing the laboratory report directly in front of Ander. "Based on genetic material obtained from both you and Elena over the past 3 months. The color drained from Ander's face as he read the clinical summary. The child Elena was carrying shared none of his genetic markers, bore no biological relationship to the man who'd been planning to name him Alexander Blackwood. Stephen Hawthorne Jr. is the biological father," I said into the stunned silence. "The same Stephen Hawthorne who's been receiving stolen information about your company for months. The same man Elena has been calling twice weekly since before your affair even began." The magnitude of the deception was finally becoming clear to them both. This wasn't just adultery or even corporate espionage. It was a honey trap operation designed to destroy Blackwood Industries from within while creating false paternity, claims that could complicate inheritance and succession issues for years to come. Elena was crying now, tears streaming down her face as the carefully constructed lies collapsed around her. Anders sat frozen, staring at the DNA results as if they might change if he looked long enough. But this was only the beginning. The evening was still young, and I had so much more to reveal. The restaurant seemed to fade around us as the magnitude of the revelations settled over our table like a toxic cloud. Other diners continued their conversations, completely unaware that at table 12, 2 lives were being systematically dismantled with the precision of a surgical procedure. Elena's tears had stopped, replaced by a hollow-eyed stare that suggested she was calculating her options and finding them all catastrophic. Ander remained frozen, the DNA report clutched in his trembling hands as if he could somehow will the scientific facts to change through sheer force of denial. "This can't be real," he whispered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "The pregnancy." She showed me the ultrasound. We went to appointments together. "Oh, the pregnancy is very real," I confirmed, producing another document from what seemed like an inexhaustible manila envelope. But the father was never in question for those who bothered to do the actual investigation. I slid a medical record across the table, Elena's prenatal care documentation from a clinic in Tempe, showing a conception date that predated her first encounter with Ander by nearly 2 weeks. The timeline was damning, scientifically precise, and completely irrefutable. "You see, darling," I continued, addressing my husband with the same tone I might use to explain a complex business proposal, while you were busy playing the sophisticated older man sweeping a naive young woman off her feet, Elena here was already pregnant with Stephen Hawthorne's child and looking for a convenient patsy to blame. Anders' face cycled through a series of emotions: shock, rage, humiliation, and something approaching grief as he realized the depth of his own stupidity. The powerful executive who'd built his reputation on reading people and situations had been played like a violin by a woman who'd needed less than 6 months to destroy his marriage, his business relationships, and his dreams of fatherhood. "But why?" he asked, looking between Elena and me as if one of us might provide an explanation that would make sense of this nightmare. "Why go to all this trouble? What was the point?" "Money," I replied simply, producing a series of bank statements and wire transfer records. Corporate intelligence is extremely valuable, especially when it comes with insider access to strategic planning meetings and proprietary technology development. The financial records painted a clear picture of Elena's true employment arrangement. Regular payments from shell companies linked to Hawthorne Corporation, bonuses tied to the quality and timeliness of information delivered, and a substantial completion bonus scheduled for delivery once Blackwood Industries' expansion into Asian markets was successfully sabotaged. $25,000 per month, I read from one of the documents. Plus performance incentives. Quite a bit more than a marketing coordinator's salary, wouldn't you say? Elena finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "How did you find all this? The accounts were supposed to be untraceable?" I finished, for her, with a smile that held no warmth. "Elena, darling, I've been investigating financial crimes since before you learned to drive. Swiss banking privacy laws have been significantly weakened in recent years, and cryptocurrency transactions leave digital footprints that are surprisingly easy to follow when you know where to look." I spread out additional documents like a dealer laying out a winning hand: cryptocurrency wallet addresses, international wire transfers, communication logs between Elena and her handlers at Hawthorne Corporation. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an unassailable case of industrial espionage and fraud. "The beauty of your operation," I continued, "was supposed to be its simplicity. Seduce the CEO, get pregnant, claim paternity, and gain permanent access to Blackwood Industries' boardroom through marriage and family connections. Even if the relationship eventually soured, you'd have legal standing to demand financial support and continued access to sensitive information. Ander was staring at the financial records with the expression of a man watching his own execution. Every document reinforced the same devastating truth. He'd been nothing more than a mark in an elaborate con game, targeted specifically for his position and his access to proprietary information. "The Meridian Project," I said, pulling out a folder marked with Blackwood Industries' confidential stamp. "Your revolutionary manufacturing process that was supposed to give the company a 10-year competitive advantage in the Asian markets. Imagine your surprise when Hawthorne Corporation announced their own breakthrough technology last month." The folder contained detailed schematics, production timelines, and cost analyses, all bearing Elena's fingerprints from when she'd photographed the documents during one of her visits to Ander's home office. The intellectual property theft was comprehensive and devastating, representing millions of dollars in research and development that had been handed to their primary competitor. "You gave her access to everything," I said to Ander, my voice carrying a note of genuine disappointment. "The home office, the company servers, the board meeting preparations. You trusted her completely." "She was carrying my child," Ander said. Weakly, as if this explained everything. "Stephen Hawthorne's child," I corrected. "A child who was conceived as part of a long-term strategy to infiltrate and destroy your father's company. Even the timing of the pregnancy announcement was calculated to maximize your emotional vulnerability." Elena's composure finally cracked. Completely. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "I didn't have a choice. They had leverage, things about my past, my real identity. If I didn't cooperate, they would have destroyed me." "And yet you chose to destroy others instead," I replied, without sympathy. "The choice was always yours, Elena. You could have gone to the authorities, reported the coercion, asked for protection. Instead, you decided that ruining an innocent man's life was preferable to facing the consequences of your own actions." The evidence continued to mount. Recorded phone conversations, email threads, even photographs of Elena meeting with Stephen Hawthorne Jr. at various locations around Phoenix. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its thoroughness and chilling in its casual cruelty. But even as I laid out the full extent of their betrayal, I knew this was still just the appetizer course. The main event was yet to come, and both Ander and Elena were about to learn that corporate espionage was the least of their legal problems. The evening was far from over, and justice demanded a much more comprehensive accounting. "Let's take a trip down memory lane, shall we?" I said, producing a leather-bound photo album that I'd kept hidden beneath the other documents. The wedding album from 15 years ago looked almost quaint compared to the corporate espionage files scattered across our table, but it served a crucial purpose in what I was about to reveal. I opened to the first page, showing Ander and me on our wedding day, radiant and seemingly innocent. "Do you remember this moment, darling? When you promised to love, honor, and cherish me? When you swore before God and your father that you would be faithful?" Ander's jaw tightened as he stared at the photograph. "That was a long time ago, Erica. People change. Marriages evolve." "Indeed they do," I agreed, turning the page to reveal photos from our first anniversary celebration. "This was taken at La Bernardin in New York. You gave me that pearl necklace? Your grandmother left you. Do you remember what you said that night?" His silence was answer enough, but I continued anyway. "You said that marriage was like building a business. It required constant investment, careful planning, and absolute trust between partners. Very prophetic, considering what was about to unfold." I flipped through several more pages, each one chronicling a milestone in our relationship that had been corrupted by subsequent events. Our 5th anniversary trip to Paris, the same city where Ander had later taken Elena for a business conference. The charity gala where we'd been photographed as Phoenix's power couple 2 weeks before he started his affair. The groundbreaking ceremony for Blackwood Industries' new facility, where Elena had gained access to confidential expansion plans. You see, the beautiful thing about having an investigator's background, I continued, is that I document everything. Every important moment, every significant conversation, every promise made and broken. I withdrew a different kind of photo from the album, surveillance images I'd taken over the past 8 months. Ander and Elena at restaurants, hotels, his downtown apartment. But these weren't just evidence of adultery. They were time-stamped proof of when classified information had been transferred. March 15th, I said, pointing to a photo of them leaving his office after hours. The same night Blackwood Industries board approved the Meridian project. Notice how Elena's purse seems unusually bulky? That's because it contained a portable scanner and several gigabytes of storage capacity. Anders' face went white as he realized the implications. Every romantic evening he'd thought they were sharing had actually been a data harvest operation, with Elena systematically photographing and stealing everything she could access. April 23rd, I continued, showing another image. Your romantic weekend in Scottsdale. While you were sleeping off that expensive bottle of wine, Elena was in your home office copying the client database and the Asian expansion timeline. She worked for 3 hours, photographing every document in your files. Elena had stopped crying and was now staring at me with something approaching awe. How could you possibly know all this? Because I was watching, I replied simply. Every move, every meeting, every betrayal. While you thought you were conducting a secret affair, I was conducting the most comprehensive investigation of my career. I turned to a new section of evidence, phone records that showed a pattern of communication between Elena and multiple handlers at Hawthorne Corporation. The operation had been far more sophisticated than even I had initially realized. Stephen. Hawthorne Jr. wasn't your only contact, I said to Elena. There was also Gail Morrison from their strategic planning division, and someone using the codename Jasper who handled financial transfers. This was a coordinated intelligence operation involving at least 4 different operatives. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Hawthorne Corporation had invested significant resources in infiltrating Blackwood Industries, suggesting they viewed my husband's company as a serious threat that needed to be neutralized through industrial espionage rather than fair competition. But here's where it gets really interesting, I continued, producing a series of internal Hawthorne Corporation emails that I'd obtained through a contact in cybersecurity consulting. The operation wasn't just about stealing information, it was about destroying Blackwood Industries entirely. The emails detailed a multi-phase plan that went far beyond simple corporate espionage. Phase 1 had been Elena's seduction of Ander and the theft of proprietary technology. Phase 2 involved using the pregnancy to create leverage for long-term access to the company's strategic planning. Phase 3 was the most sinister, a coordinated media campaign designed to destroy Ander's reputation and trigger a hostile takeover of Blackwood Industries. They were planning to expose your affair publicly, I explained to Ander, along with fabricated evidence of financial impropriety and sexual harassment. The pregnancy would have been presented as proof of your predatory behavior toward young employees. The media scandal would have tanked the company's stock price and opened the door for Hawthorne to acquire Blackwood Industries at a fraction of its actual value. Ander was now physically shaking as he absorbed the full magnitude of how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. This wasn't just personal betrayal. It was a calculated attempt to destroy everything his father had built over 40 years. The beautiful irony, I continued, is that Elena's pregnancy actually accelerated their timeline in ways they hadn't anticipated. Stephen Hawthorne Jr. got careless, started making more frequent contact, left digital footprints that my investigation could follow. I showed them printouts of Stephen's credit card records, hotel bookings that coincided with Elena's business trips, and even restaurant receipts from their romantic dinners while she was supposedly devoted to Ander. Love makes people stupid, I observed. Even professional con artists start making mistakes when genuine emotions get involved. Stephen Hawthorne actually fell for his own honey trap operative. Elena's composure cracked again as she realized that even her relationship with Stephen had been exposed and documented. Every aspect of her double life had been unraveled with methodical precision. "The question now," I said, gathering the photos and documents with the efficiency of someone who had presented cases to juries for years, "is what we do with all this evidence." Both Ander and Elena stared at me with the desperate hope of drowning swimmers who'd just spotted a potential rescue boat. They still believed this might be a negotiation, that I might be willing to make some kind of deal to keep their secrets safe. They had no idea that the real show was just beginning. "Before we discuss what happens next," I said, reaching into my purse for what appeared to be a simple business card holder, "I think it's time you both understood exactly who you've been dealing with." I placed 3 business cards on the table with the precision of a card, sharp, revealing a royal flush. The first was familiar, my standard Meridian Investigations card that Ander had seen countless times over the years. The second was newer, crisper, bearing the seal of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. The third carried the logo of the Securities and Exchange Commission. "Erica Blackwood, licensed private investigator," I said, tapping the first card. "Erica Blackwood, special consultant to the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force," I continued, indicating the second. "And Dr. Erica Blackwood, certified forensic accountant for the SEC's Corporate Fraud Division." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient restaurant noise seemed to fade as the implications of my revelation settled over our table like a death shroud. "Impossible," Ander whispered, his voice barely audible. "You've been running a private investigation firm. I've seen your client files, your case reports. All perfectly legitimate," I confirmed. "But did you ever wonder why my little private firm was so successful? Why high-profile clients sought me out for the most sensitive cases? Why my success rate for complex fraud investigations was nearly 100%? I pulled out a leather credential case, displaying my federal consultant badge alongside certifications from the American Board of Forensic Accounting and the International Association of Financial Crimes Investigators. The credentials were impressive, but more importantly, they were current. I've been working federal cases for 8 years, Ander. Ever since the Morrison Industries investigation, you remember, the one where I supposedly left government work to start my private practice, that was my cover story. The FBI needed someone who could operate in Phoenix's elite business community without raising suspicion. Elena was staring at me with something approaching horror as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. She hadn't just been stealing from a successful businessman, she'd been conducting industrial espionage under the nose of a federal law enforcement consultant. The beautiful irony, I continued, is that Hawthorne Corporation's operation against Blackwood Industries fell squarely within my federal jurisdiction. Corporate espionage, interstate commerce violations, securities fraud. It's exactly the kind of case I was placed here to investigate. I withdrew a thick manila folder marked with official federal seals and classification stamps. This is a formal FBI investigation file, opened 6 months ago based on intelligence suggesting that Hawthorne Corporation was engaged in systematic industrial espionage against multiple competitors. Anders' face was cycling through emotions so rapidly it was almost comical. Shock, betrayal, confusion, and dawning horror, as he realized that his wife's profession had made her the worst possible person to cross. Blackwood Industries wasn't the only target, I explained, opening the file to reveal surveillance photos of other Hawthorne operatives. There were similar honey trap operations running against Meridian Technologies, Coastal Manufacturing, and Pinnacle Solutions. Elena wasn't a unique asset. She was part of a systematic campaign of corporate terrorism. Elena's hands were trembling as she stared at photographs of people she'd worked with, trained with, people she'd believed were part of her secret world that law enforcement could never penetrate. "Gail Morrison," I said, pointing to one of the photos. Real name is Gail Patterson. Wanted in 3 states for securities fraud. The man you knew as Jasper? His name is James Rodriguez, and he's been funneling cryptocurrency payments for organized crime groups since 2019. I turned the page to reveal financial flowcharts that traced money from Hawthorne Corporation through a maze of shell companies, cryptocurrency exchanges, and offshore accounts. The visualization was damning, showing how Elena's operation was funded by the same networks that supported human trafficking and drug smuggling operations. You see, Elena, when you agreed to steal from my husband's company, you weren't just committing corporate espionage. You were participating in a criminal enterprise that the Department of Justice has been tracking for years. The restaurant seemed to spin around Elena as the reality of her situation became clear. She wasn't just facing corporate fraud charges. She was potentially looking at RICO violations, conspiracy charges, and association with organized crime networks. But I didn't know, she stammered. They told me it was just business intelligence, competitive research. Ignorance isn't a defense, I replied with the clinical detachment of someone who'd explained federal sentencing guidelines to countless defendants, especially when you were being paid through the same channels used to fund international criminal operations. Ander was staring at me as if I were a complete stranger. How long? He asked. How long have you been, whatever this is? A federal consultant? 8 years. Investigating corporate fraud in Phoenix specifically? 5 years. Watching your affair with Elena and building a case against Hawthorne Corporation? 6 months. I leaned back in my chair, allowing them both a moment to absorb the magnitude of their miscalculation. They had thought they were playing a game of adultery and business rivalry. Instead, they had walked into the middle of a federal investigation that could send them both to prison for decades. The question now, I said, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I used when interviewing suspects, is whether you're going to cooperate with the federal investigation, or whether you're going to compound your existing legal problems by continuing to lie to a federal law enforcement consultant. Elena looked like she might faint. Ander appeared to be calculating something in his head, probably wondering if there was any way to minimize his exposure now that he understood the true scope of what he'd stumbled into. But they still didn't understand the full extent of their problems. The federal investigation was comprehensive, but it was far from the only threat they were facing. The evening was still young, and I had several more surprises in store. I opened a second federal folder, this one even thicker than the first, marked with multiple agency seals. What you've seen so far represents about 20% of the evidence we've collected. The FBI doesn't build cases on single operations. We map entire networks. The first document I withdrew was a comprehensive organizational chart showing Hawthorne Corporation's criminal enterprise. Names, photos, financial connections, and criminal histories were laid out with the precision of a military operation. Elena's face appeared in the middle of the chart, connected to dozens of other operatives through red lines indicating financial transfers and blue lines showing communication patterns. 47 active operatives, I said, tracing the connections with my finger. 18 companies targeted for industrial espionage. Over $30 million in stolen intellectual property. This isn't just corporate competition. It's systematic economic terrorism. Elena stared at the chart with growing horror as she recognized faces from her training sessions, people she'd worked with, people she'd trusted. The scope of the organization was far beyond anything she'd imagined when she'd agreed to seduce one businessman in Phoenix. Bank records, I continued, producing thick printouts of financial transactions. Every payment to Elena, every cryptocurrency transfer, every shell company transaction. We've traced the money back to its sources. Hawthorne Corporation, yes, but also the Kozlov crime family in Eastern Europe and the Mendez cartel in Mexico. Anders' face went gray as he absorbed the implications. His wife wasn't just a federal consultant. She was investigating international organized crime networks that had used his company as a target. Elena received payments through the same channels. Used to launder money from human trafficking operations, I explained with clinical detachment. Same bank routing numbers, same cryptocurrency wallets, same offshore accounts. In the eyes of federal prosecutors, she's part of a continuing criminal enterprise. I spread out surveillance photos taken at locations across the Southwest, meetings in hotel lobbies, cash exchanges in parking garages, encrypted phone calls made from burner devices. Elena appeared in several of the images, always meeting with the same handler who also appeared in photos related to drug smuggling operations. Your handler, Elena, the woman you knew as Sarah, her real name is Sarah Chen. She's wanted by the DEA for coordinating cocaine shipments through Phoenix, the FBI for money laundering, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement for facilitating human trafficking networks. Elena's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold her wine glass. The romantic narrative she'd constructed around her relationship with Stephen Hawthorne was dissolving into a nightmare of federal charges and organized crime connections. Wiretap transcripts, I said, producing yet another stack of documents. Every conversation Elena had with her handlers over the past 6 months. Every instruction she received, every piece of stolen information she transmitted, every lie she told my husband. I opened to a random page and read aloud. Target is completely compromised. Access to all company files confirmed. Ready to initiate. Phase 2 of asset extraction. That was Elena, 3 weeks ago, describing her relationship with you, Ander. The clinical language of espionage reports reduced their passionate affair to nothing more than a business transaction. Every intimate moment had been documented, analyzed, and reported to criminal handlers who viewed human emotions as tactical advantages to be exploited. The federal sentencing guidelines, I continued, recommend 25 years to life for participation in continuing criminal enterprises. Elena faces potential charges under RICO statutes, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the Economic Espionage Act, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Elena was hyperventilating now, the full scope of her legal jeopardy finally becoming clear. Now, let's discuss your role in all this, darling, I said, turning my attention to Ander with the methodical precision of a prosecutor presenting to a grand jury. From my briefcase, I withdrew a folder marked with his name, one that was disturbingly thick for someone who supposedly had no knowledge of the criminal conspiracy. You see, while Elena was conducting industrial espionage, I was conducting a parallel investigation into Blackwood Industries' financial irregularities. The timing was quite fortuitous, actually. I opened the folder to reveal bank statements, wire transfer records, and accounting documents that painted a damning picture of financial misconduct spanning several years. Anders' face went white as he recognized his own signature on dozens of questionable transactions. The Henderson construction contracts, I said, placing the first set of documents on the table. 47 separate payments totaling $3.2 million to a company that exists only on paper. Very creative accounting, considering Henderson Construction has no employees, no equipment, and no business address beyond a P.O. box in the Cayman Islands. Anders' mouth opened and closed wordlessly as he stared at evidence of what appeared to be systematic embezzlement from his own father's company. The irony was brutal. While investigating Elena's theft of corporate secrets, I'd uncovered Anders' theft of corporate funds. Then there's the mysterious consulting fees, I continued, producing another set of documents. Meridian Strategic Solutions. Doesn't that sound familiar? You've been paying yourself through a shell company for strategic consulting work. 18 months of payments, each carefully structured to fall just below federal reporting thresholds. Elena was staring at Ander with a mixture of horror and fascination. The man she'd been conning was apparently running his own elaborate fraud scheme, completely independent of her operation. They had been two criminals unknowingly targeting each other. The most interesting discovery, I said, withdrawing a thick stack of property records, was the real estate portfolio you've been building under various corporate entities. 7 properties across Arizona and Nevada, all purchased with funds diverted from Blackwood Industries' operational budget. I spread out photographs of luxury condominiums, vacation homes, and commercial properties that Ander had been acquiring while claiming the company was struggling with cash flow issues. The hypocrisy was staggering. He'd been crying poverty to his father while secretly building a personal empire worth millions. But here's where it gets really interesting, I said, producing a series of loan documents. You've been using these properties as collateral for personal loans, then funneling that money through offshore accounts. The paper trail suggests you were planning your own exit strategy long before you met Elena. Ander was now sweating profusely, his expensive shirt clinging to his skin as he realized the scope of his exposure. His affair with Elena wasn't just personal betrayal, it was a sideshow to his own systematic looting of his father's company. The tax implications alone, I continued with clinical detachment, represent potential criminal liability. Unreported income, falsified business expenses, fraudulent charitable deductions. The IRS is going to be very interested in your creative accounting methods. Elena's hand moved instinctively to her belly as she absorbed this new information. The man whose child she'd claimed to be carrying was apparently as much of a criminal as she was, just in completely different ways. And then there's the matter of your father's medical care, I said, producing the most damning documents yet. The experimental treatments he's been receiving, the ones insurance wouldn't cover, you've been billing those expenses to Blackwood Industries as executive health benefits, while pocketing the insurance reimbursements yourself. The silence that followed was crushing. Ander had been stealing from his own incapacitated father, exploiting the old man's illness for personal profit, while publicly playing the devoted son managing the family business during a difficult time. You're both probably wondering how I managed to uncover so much information while maintaining the facade of the dutiful wife, I said, closing Ander's criminal file with finality. The answer lies in something neither of you bothered to investigate, my actual background before our marriage. I withdrew a leather portfolio that had been hidden beneath all the other documents, this one bearing the seal of the United States Department of Justice. The contents would reshape everything they thought they knew about our relationship and my capabilities. Erica Michelle Thompson, I said, reading from an official government document. That was my name before I married you, Ander. You never thought to run a comprehensive background check on your own wife, did you? The first document I placed on the table was a commendation letter from the director of the FBI, praising my work on Operation Silver Web, a multi-year investigation that had dismantled a cryptocurrency money laundering network responsible for over $200 million in illegal transactions. I wasn't just investigating financial crimes when we met, I continued. I was the lead federal agent on the Morrison Industries case. You didn't help me prove the allegations were false, darling. I allowed you to believe you were helping, while I built an airtight case that sent 17 executives to federal prison. Elena was staring at me with something approaching terror as she realized the true scope of her miscalculation. She hadn't just targeted a businessman's wife. She'd unknowingly conducted espionage operations under the direct observation of one of the FBI's most successful undercover agents. The beautiful irony, I continued, producing photographs from various undercover operations, is that marrying you provided the perfect cover for my next assignment. Phoenix was becoming a hub for international financial crimes, and the Bureau needed someone with permanent local ties who could operate at the highest levels of business and society. I showed them images of myself at charity galas, business, conferences, and exclusive social events, all federal operations where I'd been gathering intelligence on white-collar criminal networks. Our entire marriage had been, from my perspective, an elaborate undercover assignment. Every business dinner you thought I was hosting to support your career was actually an intelligence-gathering operation, I explained. Every social connection I made in Phoenix society was a potential asset in ongoing federal investigations. Our anniversary parties, charity events, even our family vacations, all opportunities to develop sources and gather information. Anders' voice came out as barely a whisper. 15 years? 15 years of the most successful long-term undercover operation in Bureau history, I confirmed. During our marriage, information I gathered led to 43 federal convictions, the seizure of over $500 million in criminal assets, and the dismantling of 6 major international crime syndicates. I opened to a page showing surveillance photos of Ander himself at various business functions, completely unaware that his wife was documenting his activities for federal review. The timestamps went back years, showing that I'd been monitoring his increasingly questionable behavior long before Elena appeared on the scene. Your father's stroke wasn't just a personal tragedy, Ander. It was the catalyst that finally gave you enough rope to hang yourself. The moment you started stealing from the company, you crossed into federal jurisdiction. Elena's appearance was just unfortunate timing. Elena looked like she might be sick. You've been watching everything, planning everything. Not planning. Documenting, I corrected. Both of you made your own choices. I simply ensured that those choices would have appropriate consequences. I withdrew one final document, my actual FBI badge and credentials, showing my rank as senior special agent and my clearance level for counterintelligence operations. The woman they'd thought they were manipulating was actually one of the most decorated federal agents in the Bureau's white-collar crime division. The question now, I said, my voice taking on the unmistakable authority of federal law enforcement, is whether you're going to cooperate with multiple ongoing federal investigations or whether you're going to make this situation significantly worse for yourselves. The evening's final revelation had landed. They hadn't just betrayed a wife and businesswoman, they'd committed federal crimes under the direct observation of a senior FBI agent. As if summoned by my revelation, 2 men in dark suits appeared at the entrance to Meridian Gardens' dining room. Their practiced eyes swept the restaurant before settling on our table with the precision of guided missiles. I raised my hand slightly, a subtle signal that brought them directly to us. Agent Rodriguez, Agent Chen, I said, rising from my chair with the fluid authority of someone accustomed to coordinating complex operations. Perfect timing. Elena's face went white as she recognized the second agent's name. This wasn't Sarah. Chen, her criminal handler. This was FBI Special Agent David Chen, whose photograph she'd seen in federal prosecution documents during her brief research into law enforcement agencies. Senior Agent Thompson, Rodriguez replied, using my real surname as he approached our table. We have confirmation that all primary targets are in custody. Stephen Hawthorne Jr. was arrested at his Scottsdale residence 43 minutes ago. The words hit Elena like physical blows. Her entire support network, Stephen, Gail Morrison, the man she'd known as Jasper, all were being rounded up simultaneously while she sat trapped in this elegant restaurant, thinking she was having dinner with a rival and her victim. Outstanding, I replied, checking my watch with the practiced precision of someone who'd coordinated dozens of multi-jurisdiction operations. And the financial assets? Frozen as of 2200 hours, Agent, Chen confirmed. The Cayman accounts, the cryptocurrency wallets, the shell company holdings, everything's locked down pending federal seizure proceedings. Ander was staring at the federal agents with the expression of a man watching his own execution. Every escape route he might have imagined, fleeing to one of his hidden properties, accessing his offshore accounts, calling in favors from business associates, was being systematically eliminated in real time. Elena Kowalski, Agent Rodriguez continued, producing a leather credential case. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit economic espionage, money laundering, and participation in a continuing criminal enterprise. The Miranda rights that followed seemed to echo in the suddenly silent restaurant. Other diners had begun to notice the commotion, their romantic evenings interrupted by the sight of federal agents making arrests at the table by the window. Anderson Blackwood, Agent Chen announced, turning to my husband. You're under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to defraud the United States. Anders' legs seemed to give out beneath him as the full reality of his situation crashed down. He wasn't just losing his marriage and his mistress, he was losing his freedom, his company, and quite possibly the rest of his life. "Wait, Elena," gasped, her voice barely audible above the sound of handcuffs clicking into place. "I want to make a deal. I have information about other operations, other targets. You'll have plenty of opportunity to discuss cooperation with federal prosecutors," I said, my tone carrying the clinical detachment of someone who'd watched this scene play out countless times. "Though I should mention that your former associates are probably making similar offers as we speak." The restaurant's maitre d' approached discreetly, clearly experienced in handling unusual situations with minimal disruption to other guests. A few whispered words ensured that the arrest would be conducted with as much dignity as possible, though there was no hiding the sight of two well-dressed individuals being led away in handcuffs. As the agents prepared to escort them out, Elena turned back to me with desperation in her eyes. "The baby? Stephen's baby? What happens to—" "That's not a federal matter," I replied simply. "Family court will determine custody arrangements after your sentencing." The evening that had begun with Anders' arrogant announcement of his new life was ending with both conspirators facing decades in federal prison while I sat calmly finishing my wine. As the restaurant returned to its previous tranquil state, I remained seated at our table, surrounded by the scattered evidence of months of meticulous planning. The other diners had resumed their conversations, the brief excitement of the arrests already fading into whispered speculation about what they'd witnessed. Agent Rodriguez returned after securing the prisoners in federal transport vehicles. "Senior Agent Thompson, the Phoenix field office is requesting a preliminary debrief. Should we schedule for tomorrow morning?" "Make it 1000 hours," I replied, gathering the documents with practiced efficiency. "I'll need to coordinate with the SEC and IRS teams before we proceed with asset forfeiture proceedings." As the agents departed, I allowed myself a moment to appreciate the elegant simplicity of what had just transpired. 15 years of undercover work had culminated in a single evening that would dismantle two separate criminal enterprises while preserving the legitimate portions of Blackwood Industries for Ian's eventual recovery. My phone buzzed with a secure message from FBI Director Harrison. "Congratulations on Operation Phoenix. Preliminary reports suggest this may be the most comprehensive white-collar takedown in Bureau history. Well done, Agent Thompson." The irony of the operation's code name wasn't lost on me. Phoenix, the city where I'd spent 15 years building, my cover identity, and the mythical bird that rises from ashes. Tonight, Erica Blackwood had died, and senior FBI agent Erica Thompson had been reborn from the flames of betrayal and deception. Opened my laptop and began typing the preliminary case summary that would become part of federal prosecution files. Subject Blackwood, Anderson James, engaged in systematic embezzlement of corporate funds over 18-month period, utilizing shell companies and offshore accounts to divert approximately $12.3 million from Blackwood Industries' operational budget. Financial analysis indicates premeditated exit strategy involving real estate investments and fraudulent tax schemes. Subject Kowalski, Elena Marie, operated as industrial espionage asset for Hawthorne Corporation criminal enterprise, utilizing false identity and romantic manipulation to gain access to proprietary technology and strategic planning documents. DNA analysis confirms fraudulent paternity claims designed to establish long-term access to target corporation. Coordinated investigation between FBI, SEC, and IRS resulted in simultaneous arrests of 47 operatives across 6 states, seizure of $47 million in criminal assets, and recovery of stolen intellectual property valued at approximately $200 million. The personal cost of the operation was significant. My marriage was destroyed, my cover identity was blown, and 15 years of carefully constructed relationships would need to be abandoned. but the professional satisfaction was immense. This case would likely become a textbook study in long-term undercover operations and multi-agency coordination. A text message arrived from Dr. Sarah Chen at the genetics lab. DNA samples from all subjects secured for federal evidence chain. Final paternity report confirms Stephen Hawthorne Jr. as biological father. Labs sealed and ready for prosecution presentation. Another message. This one from Marcus Rodriguez at Phoenix PD. City prosecutor declining local charges in favor of federal jurisdiction. All evidence transferred to FBI custody. Outstanding work, Agent Thompson. The complexity of coordinating local, state, and federal agencies for tonight's operation had required months of careful planning. Every detail, from the restaurant reservation to the timing of the arrests, had been choreographed to ensure maximum legal impact while minimizing the risk of evidence contamination or procedural challenges. Most importantly, Ian Blackwood's company would survive. The board of directors had been briefed on the situation and were prepared to implement emergency succession planning that would preserve the legitimate business operations while excising the criminal elements that threatened its survival. As I closed my laptop and prepared to leave Meridian Gardens for the final time as Erica Blackwood, I reflected on the strange satisfaction of a job well done. Justice had been served with surgical precision, and two criminals who had thought themselves clever had learned the hard way that some people should never be underestimated. The evening that began with humiliation had ended with the complete vindication of 15 years of patient, professional dedication to law enforcement. The morning after the arrests, Phoenix awakened to a media firestorm that would reshape the city's business landscape for years to come. I watched from my hotel suite as news vans surrounded Blackwood Industries headquarters, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. Breaking news, massive corporate espionage ring dismantled, scrolled across every major network, accompanied by photographs of Ander and Elena being led away in handcuffs. The story had everything the media loved: sex, betrayal, international conspiracy, and enough financial intrigue to fuel weeks of investigative reporting. My secure phone rang with calls from federal prosecutors, congressional oversight committees, and international law enforcement agencies. The Hawthorne Corporation investigation had uncovered connections to criminal enterprises in 7 countries, triggering a cascade of international arrest warrants and extradition requests. Agent Thompson, came the voice of Assistant Director Williams from Quantico. The President's Economic Security Council wants a full briefing on Operation Phoenix. How soon can you be in Washington? 48 hours, I replied, watching, as FBI forensic accountants emerged from Blackwood Industries carrying boxes of evidence. The local prosecution team needs my testimony for the preliminary hearings before I can travel. The financial consequences were already becoming apparent. Hawthorne Corporation's stock had plummeted 60% in pre-market trading as investors fled anything connected to the criminal conspiracy. Their board of directors had called an emergency meeting to discuss potential bankruptcy proceedings, and their primary business partners were severing contracts to avoid association with the scandal. Meanwhile, Blackwood Industries was experiencing an unexpected surge of support. Ian Blackwood's reputation for integrity, combined with the revelation that his company had been the victim rather than the perpetrator of criminal activity, was attracting new investors and business partners eager to demonstrate their commitment to legitimate enterprise. A knock at my door interrupted my morning briefing calls. Agent Rodriguez entered carrying a thick folder of overnight developments that painted a picture of systematic collapse among the criminal networks we'd been tracking. Stephen Hawthorne Jr. attempted suicide in federal custody, he reported with professional detachment. He's in stable condition at Phoenix General, but his cooperation prospects look promising. Apparently, he genuinely believed Elena loved him. The irony was profound. Elena had been playing Stephen just as thoroughly as she'd been playing Ander, maintaining romantic relationships with both men while serving her criminal handlers. Love had made all of them vulnerable, but only Stephen, seemed to understand the depth of his emotional manipulation. Elena's requesting immediate protective custody, Rodriguez continued. She claims her former handlers have contracts out on anyone who might testify. The Kozlov family doesn't appreciate loose ends. I wasn't surprised. International criminal organizations rarely showed mercy to operatives who'd been compromised, especially when their testimony could unravel decades of carefully constructed networks. Elena's pregnancy might actually save her life. Even hardened criminals hesitated to murder expectant mothers, though her child would likely grow up in witness protection. And Ander? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Complete. Breakdown. His attorney is exploring insanity defenses, but the evidence of premeditation is overwhelming. The real estate purchases, the offshore accounts, the systematic theft from his own father. It shows clear criminal intent over an extended period. The morning newspapers spread across my coffee table told the same story from different angles. The Phoenix Business Journal focused on the economic implications for local industry. The Arizona Republic emphasized the human drama of betrayal and deception. The Wall Street Journal analyzed the international ramifications for corporate security protocols. But it was the small item buried on page 6 of the local section that caught my attention. Ian Blackwood, responding well to treatment. According to his medical team, the shock of learning about his son's crimes had paradoxically stimulated his recovery. The old man's vital signs had improved dramatically overnight, and his speech therapy sessions were showing remarkable progress. Perhaps justice really could be healing, even for the innocent victims caught in its wake. 6 months later, I stood in the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., watching as the final defendant in Operation Phoenix received her sentence. Elena Kowalski, now visibly pregnant and wearing the orange jumpsuit of federal custody, listened impassively as Judge Morrison pronounced the words that would define the rest of her life. 22 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 18 years, provided you continue your cooperation with ongoing international investigations. Elena's baby would be born in federal custody, raised in witness protection, and would be an adult before she saw freedom again. The child of two criminals, Stephen Hawthorne Jr. and Elena, would grow up knowing only the sanitized version of their parents' story that federal marshals deemed appropriate. Stephen himself had received 25 years after his suicide attempt, failed, and his cooperation proved less valuable than prosecutors had hoped. The Hawthorne family empire was being systematically dismantled, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to the companies they'd targeted over the years. But it was Anders' sentencing 3 weeks earlier that had provided the most closure. 30 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole before 25 years served. His mental breakdown had been genuine, but not severe enough to qualify for psychiatric defenses. The man who'd once commanded boardrooms and manipulated corporate deals would spend the remainder of his productive years in a 6x8 cell. "Agent Thompson," called Assistant Director Williams as we exited the courthouse, "there's someone who'd like to speak with you." I turned to see Ian Blackwood approaching with the aid of a walking cane, his recovery from the stroke nothing short of miraculous. The doctors attributed his improvement to a combination of cutting-edge therapy and the psychological relief of learning the truth about his son's activities. "Mrs. Agent Thompson," he said, his speech still slightly slurred but much clearer than it had been 6 months ago. "I wanted to thank you personally, not just for saving my company, but for giving me the chance to rebuild it properly." Under Ian's restored leadership and with the criminal elements excised, Blackwood Industries had not only survived, but thrived. The publicity from the federal case had actually enhanced their reputation as a company committed to legitimate business practices. New contracts were flowing in from corporations eager to partner with an organization that had proven its integrity under the most extreme circumstances. "Your father would be proud," I replied, referring to the company's founder whose photograph still hung in the lobby of their headquarters. You've preserved his legacy while building something stronger. Ian nodded, then surprised me by extending a formal business card. The board has voted unanimously to offer you a position as Chief Compliance Officer should you ever decide to leave federal service. We could use someone with your unique qualifications. I smiled at the irony. After 15 years of investigating corporate crime while married to a corporate criminal, I was being offered the chance to prevent such crimes from within a legitimate organization. It was an appealing prospect for whenever I decided to close this chapter of my law enforcement career. My phone buzzed with a message from Director Harrison. Operation Phoenix final statistics: 73 convictions, $847 million in recovered assets, 12 international criminal organizations disrupted. Congratulations on the most successful long-term operation in Bureau history. As I walked down the courthouse steps into the Washington afternoon, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. 15 years ago, I'd been a young federal agent accepting an undercover assignment that was supposed to last 6 months. Instead, it had become my life's work, a patient, methodical investigation that had ultimately delivered justice on a scale I could never have imagined. The woman who emerged from Operation Phoenix was fundamentally different from the one who had entered it. Erica Blackwood had been a carefully constructed fiction, but Agent Erica Thompson was entirely real, hardened by betrayal, strengthened by purpose, and vindicated by results that would reshape how federal law enforcement approached long-term corporate investigations. Sometimes the best revenge is simply the truth, served with perfect timing and absolute authority. And sometimes, from the ashes of deception and betrayal, something stronger and more honest can rise to take its place. The Phoenix had risen indeed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.